Ladies, gentlemen, very welcome to our FSR Talks from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Today, a very interesting topic. How will we in the EU build a decarbonized economy and industry, knowing that some of us, in practice it is Germany, is also banning nuclear and is willing to decarbonize faster than the average European Union. To discuss this very interesting topic, we have with us experts from the very well-known German Institute of Economic Research in Berlin, DIW, and in concrete, we have Franziska Holz, Deputy Head of the Department for Energy, Transportation and Environment. She worked on this topic with her head, Claudia Kemfert, and you can also follow Claudia on Twitter. She has about 58K followers. Most of her tweets are in German, but from time to time you will see interesting English tweets, like 2 days ago, a comment on gas, Putin, etc., etc. But today we look at 2050 with 3 basic blocks. Of course, renewables, then clean hydrogen, then what we can call clean gases or synthetic gases. How to consider these blocks, their combination, their usefulness, their complementarities, is the job of Franziska. She will get 20 minutes to do that. After that, we have 2 reviewers, 2 commentators from Florence School, Nicolò and James, and after that, discussion with the audience. Franziska, you have the floor for 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to talk with you today. Let me share my presentation with you, where I want to share some insights of a study that I recently did with my colleague Claudia Kemfert, but also with colleagues from Bruegel, Nicolò and Ben McWilliams, and other colleagues from DIW Berlin, Alexander Roth and Robin Sogalla, as well as from DIW Econ, Frank Meissner. So this was a study, decarbonization of energy, with a focus on coal, gas, and hydrogen, that we were mandated to do by the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy by the European Parliament. So some of the focus were really set, in particular the coal, gas, and hydrogen focus. And I want to sort of share the main insights with you, and that is that we actually focused to analyze these different sectors on 3 high-level scenarios. We called them extreme corner scenarios, where we chose very different extents to which the renewable carriers could actually play out in the next decades. As Jean-Michel said, this is really a study looking at 2050. We have a few numbers for 2030, but it's a 2050 perspective that we take, and we have in mind that we have a climate neutrality target by 2050, so a target of 0 emissions in the European Union. So that means we chose 3 relatively extreme scenarios that we called all electric world, hydrogen, so much hydrogen use that we need to import hydrogen to fuel the EU, and green gases. And referring to our current world, we call that scenario green gases and old pipelines. So you see these scenarios in the lines, and you see the different extents to which they affect energy carriers in the different columns. So in an all-electric world, we would really stop using methane-based gases. We would still use a bit of hydrogen, but mostly in industrial clusters and for seasonal storage. But we would significantly expand and upgrade renewable electricity generation and overall the electricity grids in Europe. In the hydrogen world, in contrast, we would also not use methane-based gases anymore, but rather repurpose the existing infrastructure to have an extensive transmission and distribution infrastructure for hydrogen. And at the same time, we also have significant expansion of renewable electricity generation, but electricity transmission modestly strengthened because it's not the focus in this scenario, but still also a lot of electricity distribution. I will tell you more about that in a second. In particular, all across Europe, and only where hydrogen is not available, electricity really coming in the final demand. And in the third one, in the green gases scenario, we assume that current existing methane infrastructure, gas infrastructure, is maintained and continues to be used. Hydrogen, again, is only a small part in the energy system, mostly used in industrial clusters and for seasonal storage, while electricity transmission is only modestly strengthened, and distribution is strengthened where there is no availability of methane of renewable gases. So sort of that was the overview of the scenarios, and the world, the future energy system that we situate ourselves in is one that's considerably different from today's energy system, because we assume that there is electricity generation by 2050 that is to a large extent renewable. No fossil electricity generation. We assume, just before that question comes, that there is still some nuclear, but well, for simplicity, we assume that sort of the same amount of electricity from nuclear is generated as today across the EU 27, but mostly a renewable electricity based electricity generation system. And that electricity is either used directly by final consumers that you see here in those spectrograms, with an electrified transport sector, with an electrified domestic heating system, with most of industrial uses being electrified as well. In addition, or alternatively, in some sectors, you could have hydrogen, but hydrogen, if it is green or let's say low emission, then it should be based on electricity, right? It's not based on a natural gas, not gray or anything with CCS. It's an e-fuel essentially that requires electricity to be produced, and that hydrogen could be transported via its own grid, could be used in parts of the final energy demand. You could think of hydrogen vehicles, and there are some around. You could think of hydrogen being used really at the lower end of distribution systems and hydrogen heating systems, and also in industrial applications. And then you could actually further process that hydrogen at carbon dioxide in a methanation process to obtain synthetic methane. So not the fossil methane, the natural gas that we use today, but a green gas. Green because it would be based on renewable electricity and also carbon dioxide captured from a clean process that could use current gas grids, because it's the same molecule, it's methane, and could be used as gas today, for example, in domestic heating and industrial heat provision, sort of same style. And you could think of those sort of alternatively, but they're actually complementing each other. And the question in our scenarios is to what extent do they complement each other? Is the role of methane small or bigger? So let me share some results that we did or that we obtained from doing a calculation of those different scenarios. We essentially took assumptions on conversion efficiency, assumptions on final demand development, and on investment costs on the supply side, on investing into the generation capacities, into the grids, but also purchasing those fuels from abroad in case you want to import them. Here I want to show you some quantification of that. This is on the slide final energy consumption and the change between today, more or less, and 2050, so our end year of our analysis horizon. And you see very clearly each of the colored bars is a different scenario. The gray one is the green gases scenario, the red one is the hydrogen import scenario, and the blue one, the all-electric world scenario. That really each of those scenarios has a focus fuel, right? In the all-electric world, the final energy consumption of electricity is highest, while in the green gases, synthetic methane consumption is highest, and in the hydrogen import scenario, hydrogen final energy demand is highest. What you also see is that electricity consumption, final energy demand is large and it's increasing strongly compared to today in all scenarios. And that's very interesting. I mean, you know that synthetic methane consumption and hydrogen consumption today are zero essentially. So they are increasing modestly in those scenarios where they're not the focus fuel, and strongly only in their focus fuel scenario. But electricity use, in final energy consumption, so that is households, but it's also industry, is really increasing across all scenarios. So electrification of final demand is really a prime strategy, regardless of whether we want to put a focus on other e-fuels and then electricity. A large share of final energy demand will use electricity because that's really the lowest cost option. And that's logical if you think of the picture I just showed, because to produce green hydrogen, to produce synthetic methane, you need electricity, and then you add another process that is costly, that involves conversion losses. So it's much cheaper to use electricity directly wherever possible. But what does that require? Of course, that requires us to build up renewable electricity generation quickly and across all scenarios. So you have electricity generation expansion in terms of investment expenditures. I forgot the unit here. I can see that I think it's billion euros. In the blue part of the bar, you have costs for or expenditures for the power grid in the gray part of the bar, and then you have electrolyzer costs, hydrogen grid costs, as well as, let's see that better here, synthetic methane, methanation costs. Sorry, getting up here. What you also have, and that's a big part of the bars towards 2050, so after a sort of a ramp-up period towards 2030, is import costs. So we assume that both hydrogen in the hydrogen scenario, but also synthetic methane in the green gases scenario, is not available or cannot be made available in the European Union in the quantities that we would require if a larger share of demand uses those energy carriers. So we would need to import them. And we need to somehow take into account those import costs, and we try to quantify them here in this graph. So that sort of adds up to annualized investment costs for infrastructure expansion for electricity and potential other infrastructure. You see that maybe even more clearly here, that is the picture of the electricity mix, of the electricity generation mix compared between 2019, 2030, and 2050, where you see that we need a big expansion of renewables, of wind, which is the blue one, of solar, which is the yellow one, and then potentially other renewables like biomass. But if we want to turn to e-fuels, to green hydrogen or green gas, green methane, then we will need to import them a lot. So we could sort of offshore parts of the electricity generation. That's the gray part of the bar. Because if we want green e-fuels, then we really need to have somewhere that electricity needs to be produced, and that electricity generation needs to be built, and that could potentially be offshore. What you also see in this graph is that by 2050, we don't see the wide mix that we have today in electricity generation. So essentially, if we take the climate neutrality target serious, we need to phase out fossil fuels. We need to phase out the coal generation. That's very clear, I believe. And we also need to phase out the natural gas electricity generation. So all those disappear by 2050. We believe that there are still parts of that by 2030. And we see in Germany, in the German discussions, just how hard that is to phase out. but 2050 is a very clear end date. So based on these just very few selected results, let me tell you some of the political or policy recommendations that we draw from our analysis. First of all, we see relatively clearly that there is no one optimal technology portfolio, but rather really a mix where yet there is one sort of no regret result, that is that large parts of final energy demand will be electrified. Really, electrification is the prime strategy. The other very clear result, and that is really a no regret strategy, is investment in renewable energy generation. And those investments must increase compared to today's speed of renewable electricity generation build-up. And the third sort of relatively clear message is that fossil fuels must be phased out by 2050 at the very latest. But we see that there is a big trade-off for users, for producers of energy right now. And there's a big trade-off in investments in different technologies. There you have different options on the user side, electricity, hydrogen, think of domestic demand, of domestic heating, for example. You might think of transportation sector applications. You also have investment decisions to be taken now, or at least relatively soon, on the infrastructure, on the grid side. Do we need a hydrogen grid or not? That depends. We only see it in one scenario, really, where that is a robust result. And then, of course, on the production side of energy, there's big uncertainty whether we go to an electricity-only scenario or a scenario where electricity is complemented with a lot of hydrogen or a lot of green gases. So really the clear results are the renewable build-up and the fossil phase out. Otherwise, yeah, we need political decisions in the next years, but definitely 2020, 2030 should be a decade of infrastructure expansion for the electricity sector and for the electricity grids. In terms of policy tools, how to get to a climate neutral energy system, we need to make sure to have effective greenhouse gas pricing. And the FSR is also working on that very much. Issues like methane emissions need to be addressed and need to be part of the greenhouse gas pricing policy tools, and which they aren't yet. We need to make sure that if we want to import hydrogen or synthetic methane, those are really green e-fuels. So certification of those fuels must be an important part of the strategy. Also, I mentioned infrastructure multiple times now. We need energy planning that really is long-term, but across sectors. The combined and cross-sectoral planning of electricity and other potential gases, hydrogen and or methane. And really an adaptability of the energy market design, both gas and electricity, to high shares of renewables is key now. And of course, uncertainty for final consumers is a big topic right now. I said there's uncertainty of where to invest in, what type of appliances, but there needs to be support for clean appliances, in particular, and going for those electrified appliances for as large parts as possible of final energy demand. And a problem that we found already last year when we did the study, and have found again this year, of course, when we looked at the Russian energy import story, is that data is really, data quality is a big problem in the EU. We need better data, more transparent, and also ideally centrally collected data pretty urgently to really have a good way of analyze what's going on in energy sectors and how future options can look like. So I just mentioned, the current situation, that really the study, we did it last year in the fall, and now in February 2022, everything changed. We, for good reasons, put into question our or yeah, sort of almost traditional, at least we said in Germany, relationship with Russia, which of course was in the backs of our minds when we wrote about importing hydrogen or importing green gases. And I believe this is not an option anymore, not today and not by 2050. So now we also wondered, does that put into question our sort of long-term analysis towards 2050, which I think it doesn't in general, but maybe it sort of reduces the probability of the non-electrification scenarios. So the scenarios with imports are probably much less likely than they were even half a year ago. And of course, we need to, and we do actually ask these questions in large parts of Europe now. Do we have to be much faster in terms of renewable expansion? But also at the same time, do we need more focus on resilience, on redundant infrastructures, and if so, in which parts of the energy system? What I also hear a lot now is the question, do we still want to rely on markets as much as we did in the past? Or do we need more top-down decisions now? But does that mean that the internal energy market is in danger? Or overall, how can we ensure European solidarity? Is questioning our market design altogether. I think it's a lot of food for thought and for discussion for the next minutes. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present here, and I look forward to the discussions.
Oh, many thanks to you, Franziska, because the audience will understand why I was so enthusiastic about this research, because this research is asking the good questions and providing many, many possible answers. But unfortunately, I have no right to discuss your paper because we are organized this way at France School. You have discussants. I am not a discussant, but I'm very enthusiastic, and I think it's well expressing the challenges we face and possible ways of addressing these challenges, down to market design, down to anything, solidarity, etc. But the floor is to Nicolò and James. Which one wants to strike first?
I will, if I may, I will try and strike first, and then James will hit the survivors. I read, Franziska, the short version, I must confess, of the paper issued at Bruegel, and I found very interesting also because it clarifies some of the technical limits of moving from one energy carrier to the others. For instance, the fact that hydrogen cannot be simply put in all the gas infrastructures we have in place today. But I was struck by one aspect that actually you also mentioned briefly today in your presentation. In the report, you explicitly, let's say, neglect or let's say investigate only to a limited extent the demand side aspect of the issue. You say we are aware that investments on the demand side will be even larger than investment on the supply side to transform our current energy systems. We will need to change energy appliances and so on and so forth. And to address this fact, you suggest in your policy recommendations the importance for governments to show commitment to send clear guidance to customers, to consumers, residential or industrial, so that they can start changing their investment choices. And you mentioned like mandates for the phase out of gas boilers, maybe internal combustion engine based vehicles, and so on and so forth. But then my question, do you think that these signals for consumers are enough? Or given the daunting amount of this challenge, should government also put money on the table, support some consumers? I don't say everybody, but some consumers. Do you see any drawbacks in choosing this approach? Thank you.
Do you want me to answer now, or should I wait for James also to comment? I don't know what.
I think it's better if you start
one by one.
Very good. I can do that. Yeah, this is a very good point. And you probably saw that I showed only results for the supply side. And really the demand side, we felt that the data is not good enough, and that our sort of understanding of 2050 is not good enough to do our own cost and investment calculations. So it's really great if you did that in your study actually last year. Our take on the topic was that, well, we know that consumers, and that is not just households, it's also industry, have investment cycles which are very roughly around 20 years. So basically you replace your installation every few years, and for some it's shorter. You replace your car after 5 years, but for some it's longer. You don't replace your I don't know, your class manufacturing installations every 10 years, but rather after 30 or 40 years. So given that there are these investment cycles, and we now are about 25, 30 years away from 2050, we have a chance in a lot of sectors to actually replace current, often fossil-based electricity use appliances by more climate friendly, either electricity using or maybe one of the other e-fuels using appliances. So our take was those phase out mandates that you mentioned are really essential, so that investment decisions as soon as possible are not going into another fossil appliance. And we see that very clearly in domestic energy, domestic heat systems. We still have a lot of households in Germany that replace their old fuel oil heaters with natural gas boilers, and then they think that they are very efficient and climate friendly. And it's really hard to make them understand, well, we may replace that within 15 years already. It would be much more transparent for these consumers that are far away from the sector, that don't have these insights that we have, to tell them now, we will phase out by 2035. If you don't want to re-spend money in that period, better go for a heat pump or something that is really compatible with the 2050 vision that we have of our energy systems. So I'm not sure if I really want to recommend putting money on the table in terms of subsidizing particular electricity-based energy appliances. Where putting money on the table could still make sense is in some parts of R&D, of course. In large parts of Europe, consumers are not convinced of the heat pumps I just mentioned, because they are very complex technologies, and there's certainly potential to improve the technology such that it's least costly or less costly for consumers to purchase, and that's even more the case in a lot of industrial applications. So some R&D support there, certainly something where government money would be well spent.
Thank you. Nicolò, are you the second one, or is it James?
James.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, yeah, first of all, thank you, Franziska, for the presentation and indeed the paper. It's a very useful resource, and I would really encourage our attendees to go and take a look at it in full, certainly. My question is about optionality. One uncontroversial statement or outcome from the paper and the presentation is that it's virtually impossible to overbuild renewable electricity generation capacity at this point, right? And of course, the direct electrification scenario requires large amounts of electricity, but also the other two scenarios, synthetic methane heavy and hydrogen heavy are still electrified of sorts, and they are ultimately electrolytic gases and therefore require electricity even in higher quantities. However, what about differences in terms of transport or end use equipment, for example? Each scenario requires different infrastructure to facilitate the build out, cables, different kinds of pipelines, and so on. On this subject, I wanted to ask about technology neutrality. So something we hear a lot about and something that sounds inherently sort of positive or beneficial, technology neutrality, it sounds good. However, there is, of course, an implicit cost in maintaining that optionality, quite a high cost. And whilst we wait to commit to a particular path, we are to an extent facilitating the continuation of the status quo, right? So slowing the transition to a new era of energy systems. In our cost effectiveness decarbonisation study, for example, we also consider the cost comparisons over time of different technologies, but they have interrelationships between them in reality based on how you make technology choices. So all of this to say, do you see us approaching an inflection point in this regard? Do we have enough data points yet, or conversely, and perhaps you have a different take on this now since you wrote the paper, given the evolutions in the sector over the past 6 months or so, but is there some kind of threshold for optionality cost, a price for optionality that, becomes unpalatable, beyond which, we should be compelled to make a bold technology or strategy choice, accepting, of course, the risks that come with that? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this is a very challenging question. And we discussed it a lot among us authors when we finished the study, and we didn't feel ready yet to really recommend only one technology or one trajectory, which is why we chose those 3 scenarios and stuck to them. We think that there are some sort of technology windows already closing or have closed. For example, what I didn't mention at all, but what in the discussions is blue hydrogen. I think that the time for CCS is over, and really, there was not much progress at all in the last 15 years. So that is simply too late, given the cost digression that we saw in renewables. I wouldn't say that the time for green hydrogen is over yet. I think that is still very open. And with the current sort of, how can I say that, focus in the public debates on methane, on natural gas, we might even see a more of an opening of the window for synthetic methane. Now people understand that we use methane as a fuel quite a lot nowadays. So many people didn't know that 3 months ago. And that this might even have improved the opportunity for synthetic methane to be around. Contrary to what I would have thought 6 months ago, given the costs of this sort of fuel in the energy system. So I think for those 3 energy carriers that I focused on here, electricity, green hydrogen, and green synthetic methane, there is still a lot of openness. I totally agree with you that there are costs to keeping that technology openness. What I believe we need to understand better is the costs of each of those energy carriers. Right now, we are quite a lot subject to sort of biased debates. We have a lot of natural gas industry telling us we need to continue using this infrastructure, otherwise we have stranded assets, and stranded assets are bad. There needs to be a little more transparency on what are actually the drivers in much of the discourses. And that will then probably solve the question of which technology within the next years, but I wouldn't be able to tell in which time frame, to be very honest.
Thank you, Franziska. Ladies and gentlemen, participants, the audience, if you have questions, write your question in the Q&A box. For the moment, I have only one. Nicolò, you had other questions to ask?
Yeah, I have a couple of other questions. Maybe I will start with one and then see. I see that your research focus more on the supply side of the 3 different, let's say, scenarios for the European energy system, and you try to provide some estimation of the cost of where costs should be concentrated. And I was a bit surprised by the fact that in your estimates, also in the graphs that you showed earlier today, you seem to attribute roughly 65–70% of this cost in generation assets, and only when 30–35% in grids. This is interesting because, of course, we know that grids and generation assets are complement, but also substitute to some extent. So there is an interdependence between developing the two. And we know that in the industry, we hear sometimes different claims. For instance, it's famous the position by the distribution operators in Europe that they say that for every euro invested in renewable electricity, we should invest another euro in electricity grids. So this would, let's say, lead to a different allocation of costs and investments. So my question is, how did you arrive at this, let's say, allocation of costs? What were the reasons? And maybe if you see the role of grids to also address the issue of security of supply. You mentioned it in your paper. You say that for some countries that today are particularly dependent on coal, it will be more challenging to transit to a low carbon future. And so I was thinking that maybe more grids could help them. Thank you, Franziska.
Very good question. I have to admit that I was not responsible for that part of the of the quantification, so I can probably only tell you some sort of superficial insights. I believe that we really saw the main challenge in building up that. So maybe I should start with one thing first. We don't do any grid modeling here. So that probably sort of almost naturally leads to an underestimation of the role of grids in our quantification results. I fully agree with you from my other work that the sort of the balancing role of grids can be extremely beneficial if you have interconnected European electricity systems, but we didn't really look at this in this analysis here, and that maybe, well, on the one hand, it was due to our quantification strategy, but on the other hand, there's also always in the backs of our minds the fact that we see that it's very problematic to expand electricity grids. We've had the discussion for almost 20 years in Germany now, where we have a lot of our renewable potential offshore in the north and a lot of our electricity demand in the south onshore. And it's very hard to build new electricity lines and even very efficient electricity lines like HVDC lines because of a lot of public resistance. And if you want to expand electricity then cross-border, you even need to address different utilities or different grid owners, different regulators, so that doesn't make it easier, I guess. But that's sort of more for the background. In terms of quantification, it was really just not part of the focus of our analysis. And I guess the colleague who provided those numbers didn't have this industry claim in mind. I hear that for the first time. Every euro in generation is 1 euro in grids. But yeah, it's a challenging strategy, even though it would be the lowest. I mean, expanding grids would be sort of a low-cost strategy, but it's really hard to do that in today's democracies. Maybe because you just referred to coal, let me add that we don't talk about it a lot in the report, but of course the biggest challenge is in Eastern Europe. It's in the Central and Eastern European countries that currently rely, like Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, etc., to a very large extent on coal. And that challenge is not becoming smaller for them now with the very difficult situation with Russia, because their strategy to decarbonize was to use gas as a bridge fuel. And now the question is, where should that natural gas come from? They are connected only to Russia for the time being. Do we really want to expand their natural gas use to reduce emissions from the electricity sector by using Russian natural gas? That's a very difficult question. But at the same time, of course, the easy recommendation is go ahead and now expand your renewables very quickly. But the reality is that they didn't do it in the last years. It's almost a paradigm change for them to to speed up their renewable expansion. So I think we all don't look enough at that region in the European Union, yet it's a number of member states. And the challenges are probably, Jean-Michel said it's a big challenge in Germany. I would say it's even larger in many parts of Central and Eastern Europe.
Thank you.
Many thanks, Franziska. Very, very interesting comments. Now we are going to the audience. First one is Olga. Olga is saying, if electricity consumption increases in all sectors in your scenarios, aren't we losing one of the channels for greenhouse gas reductions? Is it a proper strategy? The fact that everywhere consumption is increasing, why not consumption decreasing?
Okay, I struggle to understand the question a bit, but maybe that is the point. Well, yeah, we didn't want to have something like energy sufficiency or a strong reduction of demand as part of our strategy, because we didn't want to have a controversial discussion about maybe assuming less economic growth or something like that. So we actually took consumption trends from another JRC study, so from a study from the European Commission's Joint Research Center, to not go into the debate, shouldn't we actually either decouple economic growth from energy consumption or live with the fact that we actually have already a very large standard of living that doesn't maybe require expansion of energy consumption at all. I don't think that we lose a channel of greenhouse gas reduction, but maybe I just misunderstand the question. We do, of course, assume a strong reduction of greenhouse gas emissions per sector, not just in energy production, but also because the energy consumers will use renewable-based fuels. Those consumers will also reduce then their greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly.
It does not matter much because VTech is asking a close question.
Yeah.
The question of VTech, should energy saving measures be implemented even if the cost of the energy saved becomes higher than the price of electricity from renewable sources?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, as I just said, we didn't really look at the energy savings strategy at all, and took sort of our demand trend for granted. I think this is a question for political decision makers, right? If we observe that energy saving measures are more expensive than renewables, but they prefer or they perceive a societal preference for energy savings, well, then they can always make those energy savings cheaper for the final consumer by providing subsidies to implement those energy savings measures. At the moment, this is very open, I believe. We see that there's not much energy savings or kind of like refurbishment in buildings, both private and public, done because it's so costly. So it's certainly an area where more financial support from governments can be helpful if there's a societal preference for that.
Next question is from Sami. Sami, do these scenarios make sense for all EU countries? Is there a risk that each country will choose its own path and this fact will jeopardize the energy transition? And how to avoid this bleak scenario?
Yeah, this is a very good question given our diversity in the European Union. We have 27 member states, so obviously it's hard to say they should all follow the same path at the same time. But at the same time, we need to keep in mind that we have a climate neutrality target that is valid for all 27 member states. So we're not necessarily mandating, or we're not saying that countries that have chosen nuclear as an option in their energy system should give that up, for example. So we understand that there are some country-specific pathways to be taken, but the giving up on the fossil fuel dependency is certainly required to reach the climate neutrality target, and that is certainly a topic where member states diversion from this sort of target could jeopardize large parts of the energy transition. I'm thinking of Poland, but not uniquely, with a very late coal phase out target at the moment, only in the 2040s. In particular, that coal question in Eastern Europe makes the situation really challenging, and there is not enough clarity and sort of not enough precise goals yet in the European Union to also incentivize those countries to go on the energy transition trend.
Thank you, Franziska. And now from Atir, apparently the last question we have. Atir has a question on the demand side in connection with electrification strategies. The question is, how the households' electricity demand will look like in 2050? May we think that many households will consume more than 10 megawatt hours in average every year?
Not necessarily, I would say. And not only because of energy savings, but also because of our appliances might become more efficient. And if I say heat pump, that doesn't mean a huge electricity consuming installation. I happen to have a heat pump in my own house, and we consume something about like 4,000 to 5,000 kilowatt hours per year. We don't have an electric vehicle, so I don't know that yet. But I think those options, some of them are really efficient, like the heat pump option. And we need to keep in mind that if we instead turn to e-fuels, to hydrogen or synthetic methane, we also have embodied electricity. So in that case, then only our implicit electricity consumption would be higher, but it would still be our electricity consumption. So I wouldn't say more than 10,000 kilowatt hours, but we will all see our electricity consumption increasing in the next decades. Yes.
Thank you. So I do not have any other question from the audience. So we'll give the floor back to James and Nicolò. James and Nicolò, do you have other questions burning?
Yes, absolutely. If I could ask a further one, I have a question about coal, actually, which I thought was an interesting point of the paper. You talk about, for example, the effectiveness of CO2 pricing on a phase out of coal, particularly for its use in the electricity sector. And you saw a drop off indeed from roughly 25% share in energy supply in 1990 to roughly 10 now. But we've heard recently from a few member states about the possibility of extended coal plant lifespans, delaying phase out, etc., in the context of gas prices and potential sanctions targeting Russian gas, etc. Well, just first and in a very general sense, I'd be interested to hear your sort of general reflections on this change in policy, but more specifically, what you could imagine that these policies, if indeed they manifest, might mean for the remainder of the sector in terms of compensating for this regression in one area, as you might see it, to in order to meet the overall goals for 2030 and 2050. So perhaps a more aggressive drive towards electrification or decarbonisation of other hard to abate sectors if indeed, there has to be a shift back to coal in some areas or an extension. So yeah, if you have some thoughts on this, I'd be interested.
Yeah, this is a very, very urgent question, I believe. But I think it's more a question of timing that we're addressing right now than of the overall strategy to expand our renewables. Essentially, at least in Germany, the discussion goes in the direction of shouldn't coal continue to be the bridge instead of gas? If we are going maybe for a boycott of Russian gas supplies, then we need the remainder of what's imported from other sources to continue to fuel our industries, to provide feedstock, but in particular industrial heat, and we need to fuel also our heat plants, which are hard to convert now back to coal, and we don't want to do that really. So in that case, coal might be a sort of a continued bridge in the electricity sector, but rather a bridge than a real new option for 2030 or at least not for 2050. We see that in the current debates in Germany, where we wanted actually to advance the coal phase out from 2038 to 2030. And the 2030 target is probably not in question, but the next 2 or 3 years are, and certainly that will result in higher CO2 emissions than our national annual targets were. And there's sort of the question is if we want to accept that or not, and the arbitrage is between boycotting Russian gas and accepting higher domestic emissions for a while, temporarily. And that is sort of the same arbitrage, maybe for a longer time period as Eastern European countries have, where the conversion to natural gas would have taken place in the next years with investments in new infrastructure and gas-fired heat and power plants, gas-fired heat installations. And there, I'm not sure if you really want to push them to go that route for gas-fired installations in the current situation. I think this is a very hard sort of moral decision that policymakers and all have to take right now.
Very interesting. I'm fascinated, Franziska. Really, I love this. Nicolò, you had another question to ask?
Well, actually, it was probably related to Jean-Michel. It was about the crisis in Ukraine. Franziska already mentioned. There is more and more a discussion about getting rid of Russian energy imports in the next year or 2 years. But this, of course, if we do not expand enough.
Our team made strong statements about it 1 week ago or 2 weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, because I was on holiday.
Okay, so maybe she has already read the answer. I didn't read it. But the idea is that if we want to remove, to stop using Russian energy in 1 or 2 years, we will have to build new gas import facilities, I assume, especially in the center and the east of the continent. But then this raised the issue of stranded assets, because then in 10 or 20 years, these facilities will have to be interrupted, discontinued. So I was thinking how this Ukrainian crisis affected the considerations emerged from the study, what would be the best choice to take for Europe, by Europe. Thank you.
I'm not sure if I know the best choice. If I knew that, I wouldn't be sitting here. I would be earning a lot of money somewhere. But you have a very valid point that we are talking about potentially expanding fossil natural gas infrastructure in several parts of Europe to replace potentially Russian gas. We're talking about the LNG terminals in Germany. We're talking about the LNG terminals in other parts of Eastern Europe, even though it's very hard for a lot of the landlocked countries to replace Russian gas with a strategy like LNG. And that actually doesn't make it that obvious to me that we really need to expand and build new capacities for fossil natural gas. I'm not convinced of the German LNG discussion, and that's the study that Jean-Michel referred to. I believe that the mixture of increased supplies from Norway, LNG via our neighboring countries, and energy savings, which is almost natural in the current high price environment, we can actually replace Russian gas if we wanted, at least temporarily in a time period in which we will at the same time see a further cost decrease for renewables and a further increase of renewable expansion. So we are really talking about a 2 to 4 year time window in which we might have something like a shortage, and where it's more, in my perspective, a sense of how do prices actually act in the market, how does demand react to prices, and how can we attract LNG to Europe, rather than a matter of expanding capacities, because I also see that stranded asset risk quite substantially. And the reason why we find stranded assets risky is because they provide an argument for the asset owners to continue to use them, to convince political decision makers, well, we need a business model, we don't want to go bankrupt, go find us a reason why fossil natural gas needs to be used 5 or 10 years longer. But of course, I do see the sort of insurance aspect of redundant capacities also in the natural gas sector right now. But I think there is a mixture also for the Eastern European, or there is a way, but I haven't calculated that. I only did it for Germany. But there is a way to use current infrastructure, current pipeline infrastructure, and work more with reverse flows. We did that for Ukraine in 2014, but haven't really done it for the rest of Eastern Europe, and they continue to be dependent on Russian gas. And if we were a little more creative, it's probably not that creative actually, and more courageous in terms of network management today, we would probably reduce the need for investments substantially, if not even to zero. So I'm very skeptical that we really need a lot of new fossil assets, and I would think it would be helpful to reach our climate neutrality target if we avoided as many new fossil investments as possible.
We are unfortunately obliged to stop. I had a new question from Sami, but I have no time for the question. I have no time for my own comments, except an incredible applause, because I'm so happy discussing with you, Franziska. I should have done it earlier, because I'm discussing with you as I am discussing with me. So it's a fantastic review of the issues, the challenges, the options, etc. But Nico, you want to close formally the session?
Yes.
You have the right to close it.
Oh, thank you, Jean-Michel. Very kind from you. It was basically to announce the next 2 events. Actually, in 1 week, we will have an FSR debate on the EU's hydrogen accelerator, what steps should be taken. So we will discuss again issues related about the policies around one of the 3 energy vectors mentioned by Franziska today. And on the 11th of May, we will have the next installment of this series, FSR Talk. We will move out of Europe and with some guests from India, from IIT. We will discuss climate modeling tools for India. You have the timing, you have the dates. Just subscribe if you're interested. Thank you.
So Franziska, again, congrats for the job and for the discussion. My best hello to Claudia. And for sure, we will discuss again with you as soon as possible. As soon we will have a paper stimulating our own thinking. Many, many thanks to you.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for the invitation.